international development. And over the years that's involved, in fact over the past 8 years, that's involved helping academics in different disciplines in different colleges develop and implement programs in international development. And when we were thinking earlier this spring about the significance of the events that happened last October with the restructuring of UK ODA and the creation of the GCRF, we were sort of under the impression that most of our 500-odd academic members in the university probably didn't know much about the GCRF, and I thought, well, we're really going to surprise them. But of course, in the last 2 weeks, most of you have got emails from BBSRC and MRC and XRC about, oh, we're starting the GCRF, so you've probably got an inbox full of things. You're probably some of you have already had meetings about what you're going to do. But I can tell you that what you've seen is very much the tip of an iceberg. We're very pleased today to have the opportunity for Mark Claydon-Smith to tell us about the whole iceberg. And Mark is from RCUK. He's a program manager for the GCRF in the RCUK Executive Directorate. And we have a deal, Mark and I. He'd talk about the GCRF, and I get together a group of interesting academics to have lots of ideas and comments. So I think we're looking forward to a dialogue here. And the way it's going to be structured is that Mark's going to give a presentation on the GCRF, and then we're going to have a small panel. We brought together some academics from our colleges, each of whom is from a different college and each of whom is doing work in international development with funding from a different research council. They're going to be posed some interesting questions about the challenges of working in a development context on a research council grant. And then we're going to open it up for a broad discussion. And then at the end of that, we've got nibbles downstairs. And the idea, as many of you will know in LIDC, is that this is really about interdisciplinary meetings. So we always have nibbles that stimulates the opportunity for you to go out and meet somebody in a different discipline and talk about something interesting in international development. So I hope you have a chance to do that and stay with us for that. But very pleased to begin by thanking Mark for agreeing to be with us and asking you to give us a presentation on the GCRF.
Failed to start.
Help is on its way.
I'm getting there. Here we go. Right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for being here at the end of the day. I really do appreciate it. And just to kind of contextualise a few of the points that Jeff just made, I work for Research Councils UK, which is an organisation that doesn't exist. It's actually a partnership organisation which allows the research councils to work together effectively. But it's not a legal entity, not at the moment anyway. It's very much been conceived over recent years to allow the councils to work together at every level, from at the top level, from the chief executives coming together at the strategic level, right down to the bottom in terms of how we work on an operational level. In terms of, just to give you a sense of where I've come from, my main background is within the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, where I've done various things over the years. But this is actually my third tour of duty in Research Councils UK, and in the past I've been involved in other initiatives. I was involved in the original work on Excellence with Impact around 10 years ago, for instance, and the development of that, which has then rolled through the research councils and the wider HEI system. But a few months ago, I got asked if I was interested in taking on this new role, which at the time was called the Grand Challenge Fund. It very much had a focus on interdisciplinary work, sort of how the councils could respond to new research opportunities and how they could work together in new ways, and more importantly, how the research community that we support could work together in new ways. That's much more important than how we shuffle the deck chairs of the Lara's house and swim. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'm going to be as open as I can and as candid as I can. But it's worth appreciating that we are still in a fluid and somewhat messy situation. So just to explain that a little bit, we normally have this business where we spend our time at the beginning of a parliament making our case to government. We're required to join that bit. We can't really tell you what's going on because that's part of how government works. So we do that case-making period, and then after that we know where we are in terms of future budgets and priorities and so on. We then go through a planning phase, and then having done that, we then start doing. Unfortunately, we're in this difficult situation at the moment where we're still doing all three of those. So that means that there are things that are resolved and clear, and as Jeff said, there's real progress on various things. But we are still in discussion with government about other things as well. So I know academics like facts and certainty and data and evidence and all that sort of stuff. I'll give you what I can, but I will explain if there are issues that I don't know because they are still in play. They're still uncertain. So that's, if you like, just setting the scene. In terms of the Global Challenge Research Fund, one of the worst things in life is to have more than one boss. And I'm fortunate. I've got 7 chief executives that have a particular interest in GCRF, and an immediate interest and a significant interest. But the one who is my particular chief executive is Professor Jane Elliott from ESRC, who is the Research Council's champion for international activities. And this is really helpful because Jane, as well as trying to keep her colleagues together, herding the cats, as people say, she also works on other related initiatives, such as the Newton Initiative, such as developments around Europe, and also in terms of our overseas offices, which also includes China and India. So there's kind of value in having somebody right from the top who's bringing together all those different perspectives. Just to set the scene, and it does go right the way back to the spending review, and the spending review, if you were to think of it at the highest level, and if you were to think of it in political terms, it really represents a commitment to 2 promises. And it's a commitment to David Cameron's commitment towards aid, the 0.7% of national wealth, and it's also the commitment from George Osborne towards supporting science. And the GCRF really represents those 2 issues coming together. But if you like, if that's the top-down piece, there's also a bottom-up story. As in many things in life, there's always more than one narrative to these things. And the other story behind it is how the councils have been thinking over the last 2 or 3 years about what's the best way to think about science or research in the 21st century in terms of how you bring together different expertise to seek out new interesting opportunities to kind of work on new agendas. And at the heart of that is this idea of interdisciplinary working and moving through on activities such as the team science agenda and so on. So the GCRF kind of brought together this bottom-up as well, together with this top-down perspective, and it's very much focused on a challenge-based approach. So it's looking to address global challenges in both disciplinary and interdisciplinary ways. It's looking to strengthen capability and capacity, both in the UK and overseas, and it's also very much focused on the research opportunities around, if you look around in the world today, a very dynamic global situation. So probably the first thing that GCRF actually did was contribute to the research response to the Zika outbreak in South America. And it's so in some ways the language here kind of has an element of almost like Tracy Island, scientists to the rescue. That's not what it's about. It's about taking advantage of the opportunity to understand the situation while it's in play, to gather the data, gather the understanding, and then use that as the basis for informing future responses and so on. So if that's the GCRF, its background in a political sense has both a national and also an international and global narrative behind it. So it's very much in the spirit of the government's new aid strategy, which sees the commitment towards official development assistance being reflected across the different aspects of government, including BIS, including Department of Health and so on. And so that was kind of one of our driving themes. The other one is, of course, in the global dimension. You see the Millennium Goals transforming into the Sustainable Development Goals and recently rebranded as the Global Goals, but very much setting an agenda for, if you like, a needs-driven agenda for the whole world. It's also worth pointing out the goals here are both developed and developing world goals, but within it nonetheless is a good agenda for the GCRF. The background to this is the fact that the research councils have had a substantial portfolio of research addressing development issues for a very long time. And the research councils have been active around the world. The MRC have been active in Gambia before that, in the Caribbean. Gambia for about 60 years, I think. In Uganda for about a decade. BBSRC have been very active working CGIR centres around the world. ESRC, very strong partnership with DFID in recent years. So the research councils have had development as part of their thinking for recent years. And then within the last few years, very much trying to be an active participant in the cross-government NEWT initiative, which is very much about country-to-country partnerships between the UK and elsewhere. So suddenly, if you like, in recent years, if you like, the horizons of the research councils have very much gone beyond the UK. So look at, if you like, the research contribution that we can make beyond the borders of the UK. So, we had this commitment from George Osborne for quite a lot of money, and as research councils we had to think, what's the case that we can make to government to take advantage of this opportunity? And this is really the state of play. That's probably the best way of describing it. That the government were persuaded by the argument for the Global Challenge Research Fund. And they were persuaded a little bit at first, and then over time we've made them a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more trusting about what we're doing. So for instance here, initially the blue line there is showing the allocation that government eventually made to the research councils. This was published in March. But the initial proposal was just to fund research for a couple of years and see how it goes. And that's completely unrealistic when you think about the timescale of research and, if you like, the norms of research council funding. We like to make commitments over a period of years. We don't like doing short-term supports for research. So we actually made the case and ultimately secured funding going all the way through this spending review period, and we've also got this commitment to carry on beyond. And it's worth saying at this point that the research councils, our horizon, which is not yet the same as the government's, is that we see this as an agenda for a decade. As we go through, obviously things will change, but you need that sort of perspective on something of this scale. But what's very obvious there is that we've managed to secure core funding, which is actually with the research councils, but there is still, if you like, a significant activity where we're still trying to make the case for government.
Sorry, is that accounting for inflation? So is that actually...
No, that's flat cash.
So it's actually less money?
Well, it depends. We get all that on.
So it's less money per research council, but it's more than...
No, it
In real
is
terms.
in real terms. I'll show this in a minute. But that this year, the research councils get 50 million, which kind of relates into their capacity. From next year, that's doubling across the research councils, and then is sustained through to the end of the spending review. So for all of the core research councils, ESRC, EPSRC, BBSRC, NERC, MRC, STFC, this represents a significant uplift in their portfolio. And if you look at it from the perspective of individual research councils, this is probably the only growth area within their programmes. So this kind of orientation on ODA is quite significant. And just to I think I'm going to answer your question now. If you look at where we were last year, this is pretty much the end state of our last spending review. So one of the defining features of the previous 5 years is these thematic programmes, cross-council programmes, which were never conceived with a development agenda, but actually when you look at them, a lot of them have a very strong development focus within them. So energy, global uncertainties for sure, living with environmental change, global food security. A lot of them had a global perspective within them, but they were never conceived in relation to development impacts. What has developed over recent years is the Council's contribution to the Newton Initiative, which is focused on poverty alleviation in developing countries. And then in addition, there's this core portfolio here, which is that part of the research councils which is intrinsically addressing development needs. So for instance, the global health programmes within RCUK, the agricultural programmes in BPSRC and so on. So that is kind of where we are at the moment. And if you then project forward in terms of what GCRF would mean, what we see is a significant expansion of activity across all of those headings. So the GCRF here rising to 500 million by 2020. That's bigger than most research councils, just to put it in context. Non-Newton ODA increasing, the Newton Fund increasing. Add it all together on that category there, that's bigger than any of the research councils. So the shift in significance here is something of systemic significance. It's not just another initiative. So there is a real scale behind it. And one point I'd make is that there's always a danger of looking at these funds and thinking of them in schematic terms, but actually in research terms, the agendas will cut across things. Because research doesn't get defined by funding, it gets defined by what people actually do in practice. So our case that we've put to government, very much thinking about that funding profile and also thinking about the portfolio we already had, really had three core elements to it. The first was recognising where we're strong at the moment and where the core disciplines, where we're already making a contribution towards sustainable development in various ways and sustaining that through the future. Then second category is looking both to grow those areas but also where the unmet opportunities are, where there's possibilities to orientate some of our research communities in that direction. And that's kind of also that's our stretch area. And then for me, because I came in very much looking at this from an interdisciplinary opportunity perspective, the area that I think is probably the most interesting is where we're looking at some completely different approaches towards the commissioning of research and more importantly towards the delivery of research. And this idea of transformational approaches and challenge-led approaches where we're bringing together perspectives, the expertise of different disciplinary subject experts to think about problems in a different way. So that's the kind of the philosophical split. And this was our proposal that we put into this. And it's interesting, we go back to the previous figure, that essentially the allocation pretty much maps out the core and stretch categories. So the government was persuaded that the councils could do a pretty good job at sustaining its core strengths as existing and growing that. They're convinced by that. But that's very much within the norms of individual research councils. The place that we're at the moment, and we're still working through with this, is this category here, this transformational category, and how we would actually respond to that. So that's where we are in our discussion piece. Securing the baseline funding is nonetheless fantastic, because that's what's allowed us to move forward, to start to move on course with proposals, to engage with the research community, to get people thinking about the opportunities. So we're kind of, even though we're in a halfway house, we're already moving, we're already in that kind of live phase. So, I think I said at the start, this is a challenge-led initiative. It's called the Global Challenge Research Fund, so therefore having some challenges is kind of goes with the territory. And what we have here are some initial thoughts on priority challenges, and these have emerged from three real directions, and these are not fixed. These are here just to stimulate thought and to give a little bit of specificity to thinking. But they're very much based on kind of thinking about the UK aid strategy, looking at the UN global goals, and probably the most useful third dimension is taking advice from the Department for International Development based on their feedback from people in country. So this is kind of their synthesis of need. Where we are at the moment is shortly, I mean within the next few weeks, starting to move on our consultation process. And part of that consultation, probably the most important part, is to use these as the basis for a debate. So are these the right set? And personally I think these are okay, but they're missing important areas. But then whatever set you choose, what's the detail within them? I mean, health, for instance, is such an all-encompassing kind of priority. You actually need to go a little bit beyond that. But nonetheless, that's the start of the 10 to stimulate debate. The second thing that we're very keen to do is to make sure that GCRF operates as far as possible within the norms and practices of the research councils. And that might not seem important, but some of the initiatives that the councils go into, we kind of fall into the practices of other organisations. And for us, it's quite important for something of this scale to operate like a normal research council does. And that means the community are involved with it at every level. With the commitment to peer review, commitment to Haldane, and the commitment towards independent strategic advice and governance at the highest level. Part of that is thinking about how we get advice and how we bring together different stakeholder perspectives. Part of that is setting up a strategic advisory group, which might not seem much, but actually, in terms of the research councils, it is of itself quite an innovative approach, because traditionally the councils get their advice from their own communities. We don't normally bring together a group or a source of advice that is quite as diverse as what we're talking about here. So it's a challenge for us to manage that diversity and that breadth. What we're hoping to do is to kind of move quickly to establish a group, and then move quickly to publicise and encourage open nominations, again in accordance with our normal practice. So we're trying to make this as much like a research council as possible. So the challenges is part of the piece, but there's also a cultural piece as well. There's also a community piece to this, and that's thinking about what does this agenda mean for individual academics? What does it mean in terms of thinking about a problem level approach? how do we have to frame research in a way that allows it to be legitimately classified as official development assistance? And what does that mean in terms of the future research community, in terms of bringing in new people, new relationships and so on? And probably the most significant thing is this concept of pathway to impact. And certainly in terms of making sure that everything the Research Council does can legitimately be defined as ODA. And this is, you have to always be careful with all models of impact, because they're always very simplistic, and they always have a tendency toward linearity, and people can always rubbish them and rip them out. This is just an attempt to think about a standardised model for how impact and translation might take place. And what you've got here is all the problems and complexity that you get with any form of impact. But of course, people who are more expert in this than I am, you also have the difficulty of geography, language, culture, and so on. So the processes of impact can be just as important everywhere else, with actually maybe even more difficulties. But that's kind of our conceptual model. And just framing that in terms of the research councils, we're not looking to move beyond our traditional domain. So this doesn't represent us as research councils abandoning our normal territory in terms of excellent research, and in terms of fundamental insights, innovative thinking, and so on. So we're still in the same space that we are, and that keeps us in the same challenging space where impact is concerned. Because impact, it always takes place over here. So, as with practically everything the councils do, the journey to impact involves, if you like, many actors. And here, you have many actors in the UK, and you've got actors overseas. So that pathway to impact is probably our biggest challenge to think through. And just to kind of throw something back to you in terms of thinking about impact, you can't guarantee impact, but you have to have a realistic chance of doing something that will do good in the long run. So, but optimism is good, but then a little bit of realism as well also makes a difference. And here, what we observe is that you can get impact everywhere, but you're more likely to get impact, firstly, if the problem is in sight right from the outset, and it's kind of inside throughout. Also, this idea of stakeholders, people who understand the problem, if they're involved in terms of the early stage design, they're involved with stakeholders throughout, that can make a difference. And probably, this is my own observation, what really makes a difference is if people know the impact they're trying to achieve and are motivated to do it. And you see this where people really do want to see things taken forward and go beyond just the normal scientific domain. But achieving that also means that we have to change our thinking within the research councils around this idea of pathway to impact and official development assistance. And at the moment we have a bureaucratic, we have an administrative process within the research councils, whereby we identify the research that we think is development focused, and then we report that to BIS, and then BIS report that to DFID, and then DFID report that to the LIDC. That's fine and dandy. But actually, if we're talking about a significant agenda here, where we really are talking about changing cultures and playing into the research community, we need to go beyond that. We need to make these sort of considerations not an administrative process, but part of the commissioning and the research process. So that means changing the way we think about peer review. We started to think, what does that mean in terms of the individual academics? What does it mean for reviewers? What does it mean for universities, for university support? We're kind of open at the moment. It might mean something for those partners, might mean nothing. But we do need to think through how we're going to manifest this in practice. And we're also quite careful that we want to move cautiously in this space. The other aspect that again comes across quite strongly, talking to community in particular, is the idea of reaching into countries as opposed to just sending science papers from Western Europe to Deep South. And again, we have to be cautious here, and we also have to learn the lessons from some of our partners from DFID and for those research councils that already have a presence in countries, to think about what's the most appropriate way and the most effective way of establishing useful links within developing countries. And there's quite a lot of practical issues around that. There's quite a few ethical issues as well. So again, this is kind of defining something that we're going to have to work through. We don't necessarily have the answers. And that kind of brings me to some final thoughts. So, if all I've talked about now is about the opportunity, in life, opportunity seldom comes without risk. You know, there's always a need to be a little bit cautious about the implications of all this. So this is just sharing some thoughts of the flip side of this. And the first kind of real flip side is us acknowledging our own requirements and where we are as research councils. And these are some of the things that we need to show that we have the competence in order to deliver on this agenda. So, for instance, we need to show that we can actually identify global challenges. And when I say we, I mean the UK research community with the research councils. But it's not just a case of identifying global challenges, because they're out there. It's the ones that are tractable in research, where actually research can make a difference. That's a much harder thing to do. We've got to demonstrate that we can satisfy the requirements to legitimately define what we're doing as official development assistants. And I mean legitimately doing that, rather than just, if you like, administratively show we can do it. And then there's this capability issue that I talked about a minute ago. Can we as research councils in the UK make a real difference there? Interdisciplinarity, it's like, we've been challenged for decades, as have other funding councils around the world. It is a serious agenda. And then again, this whole idea about pathways to impact, is that realistic? Is that going to work? And then probably the biggest challenge of all is, can we as research councils work together to make it all happen? So that's kind of some of the competencies that we need. It's also worth thinking about some of the risks behind this. And there's a risk that we fail on official development assistance. And if that happens, then that could have quite serious implications. And it might mean that, if you like, the legal basis on which we're supporting research fails. Unlikely, but we'll do everything to make sure that doesn't happen. But nonetheless, it's quite important that we get this right. Probably more significant is the systemic shift that we're talking about. So actually focusing so much of our portfolio towards ODA actually changed the shape of British science. And that's more likely to manifest in certain areas. But for instance, the balance between, if you like, crops for the tropics versus investing in agricultural research for the temperate UK. There's a need to balance the UK versus the global. And then probably the biggest scary thing when you start looking at the numbers is that this activity, because of how we support science, which is promises to universities and to yourselves, which typically last 4 or 5 years, at the end of this Parliament, we'll be left with huge liabilities. And if this initiative isn't continued, then that's kind of a problem. And that's kind of some of the risks. Some of the other things that are out there, as part of the aid strategy, we as research councils have got to demonstrate that we're capable. Don't really have a problem with the requirement. Having to do it by September is a bit of a worry though. But nonetheless, that's part of like a government commitment to make sure that its aid is properly spent. And then the other thing that worries me a little bit more which is that there is a parliamentary commission which is set up to keep us honest and to look at aid across government. And these guys, they've been into MRC, they've been to BBSRC, and both councils have got fairly, came through pretty well. But this agenda means that these guys will be coming to us. But more importantly, they'll be going down the food chain as well. So at some stage, the universities that are involved in development research will almost certainly be caught up with one of the audits for this organisation. Nothing wrong with that, but it's worth being prepared for it. That was certainly the lesson from the MRC. And so these are just some final thoughts to leave with you. Like I say, we still have this great big pile of cash that we're still trying to make the case for, particularly with this agenda around interdisciplinary work. I'm very interested, particularly with this audience, in feedback on good or best practices, because we are still in our thinking and development stage across all the research councils. So the kind of the feedback from the community is absolutely critical. And then again, the challenges and the pathways to impact. Two important agendas there. I think that's probably all from me. Over to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, I suspect there are a fair number of questions about what I propose we do is move right on to our panel, because Mark's final slide, and indeed much of his talk, focused not so much on the funding coming, but on the management of and development of a research council-based program in international research. And so in that dialogue about best practices and experiences, we thought it would be really good, thank you, sorry, really good to have a bit of a discussion led by some of our own academics in our colleges, and then open up for broader discussion, questions, and ideas you might have. So, as I mentioned, we've got a panel from different colleges representing experience with different research councils, and I'd like to invite them up, and we've got little signs for everybody. I think we need one more chair, but I'll just move this over here. Actually, yeah, we got a chair there too, so we can do that. Yeah. So, first off, we have Emma Crew is an anthropologist and professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at SOAS, and has held a number of ESRC grants for research in developing countries. And then Sean Clark is an epidemiologist, senior lecturer in the Department of Disease Control here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who's a principal investigator on an MRC grant for research in Africa. And finally, Kate. Kate Jones is ecologist and evolutionary biologist, professor of Center for Environment and Biodiversity Research at UCL, currently is leading development-related research supported by grants from the Natural Environment Research Council. I should say we had a couple of other research councils, but somebody fell ill from AHRC, which is a real pity, because she was going to talk about research on music and the Dinka culture. And that, I think, was a particularly interesting dimension. But I think we've got a really good team here. And the question that we asked each of our panelists to think about presenting was, first of all, a little bit about what their research is on, so we can have that interdisciplinary moment of trying to understand what other disciplines do. But then, two questions. What did you find particularly challenging about working with partners on an international development-related grant? And secondly, what would you say are the key things that funders and researchers need to get right in making such grants a success? And that answers very much hopefully the question that Mark raised about, what are the best practices that we might need. But our panelists are free to range over those. What they're not free to do is talk for very long. We have about 5 minutes for a presentation, and then we'll open it up for broader discussion. So, shall we start with Emma?
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you. Is it better with the microphone? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. Delighted to talk a little bit about my research, which is a coalition of of researchers. This research is funded by the ESRC and DFID Poverty Alleviation Fund, and it's posing the overarching question: what is the relationship between Parliament and the public when they're aiming for poverty reduction in two countries, in Ethiopia and Bangladesh? So there are researchers obviously in Ethiopia and Bangladesh and in the UK, and we are highly interdisciplinary, so we're a bunch of political scientists, public policy or administration scholars, and anthropologists. And we are looking at how MPs in those two countries interact with constituents, party workers, civil society organisations, and many others, both in the kind of capital cities, in the parliament, and also in constituencies. And we're trying to find out how they all see democracy and what kind of conclusions we might draw and what recommendations we might make about strengthening democracy. So just to say something about two challenges that we've been particularly confronting. And actually, the challenges don't particularly affect our colleagues in Bangladesh and Ethiopia more than other academics I know in the UK. The first challenge is that it's very, very difficult to do interdisciplinary work, particularly when you get down to ideas about what is rigorous methodology. And so we've had to innovate, and we've done this differently in the two countries, which then of course poses problems about comparability. But in the end, we had to negotiate slightly different tactics in the two places. And so in one country, we have one team, we're all working together. And in the other country, we have two teams who are taking a slightly different approach and then contrasting their findings. The second real challenge is getting some of my colleagues to interact with non-academics. And again, I don't think this is a particular problem in Bangladesh and Ethiopia rather than the UK. I think this afflicts some of us in the UK as well. And really, there's no other way to do this except to work extremely hard at making the case and doing it, and then praying for or making good results happen. Despite these challenges, this is probably the most successful research coalition I've ever been involved with, and I think it's because we have really put a huge emphasis on process. So the two researchers in the UK, myself and Ruth Fox at the Hansel Society, really are entirely concerned with process, and I think that makes a big difference. And so there are three processes we've been really obsessing about. And the first is planning. Well, planning started rather badly on the back of an envelope, to be absolutely honest, because of course you don't have the money to do the planning before you got the grant. So usual kind of problem. The good news was, as soon as we managed to have the money, we set up a planning meeting with the whole team from all three countries, and went into incredible detail. And the advantage of that was that we then had a plan which the whole research team had absolute ownership of, which meant we could get across the message that this really was their research in Bangladesh and Ethiopia and not the research sort of belonging to the UK researchers. But it would have been even better if we had got together before we put in this huge application, because of course it's a massive risk and most of these applications don't succeed. So my first recommendation to grant makers, including Mark, would be, can we have a small fund, please, which happens in kind of international development project world, where we can develop coalitions and networks and even proposals, so that we've got a much better chance of having southern researchers actually lead these coalitions when they get the big grants. The second process we really focused on was conceiving of research as a social and political process. Our research was obviously political, and we saw our research as a form of scrutiny. Democracy, I think, and I think this works quite well in the UK, democracy needs scrutiny, and if you don't have a free media, then you're in even more trouble. And actually researchers can perform an extremely important function as people who are scrutinising what politicians and other people with power are up to. And to do that effectively, I think you have to be at least have a long-term commitment in that particular place. And that's very often going to mean that you have to be a citizen of that place. So what that meant was that the people who were doing the research, producing the outputs, influencing people, and taking complete control, really, of the content, are all nationals in those countries. So two recommendations come out of that to grant makers. One is, I think a lot of research is conceived of as addressing problems like we've heard today. But actually I think there is a very important function for research as a process of scrutiny. And I might add actually that I think one of the missing topics is perhaps the whole area of governance. And I know the argument that things like governance, which I would include not just things like democracy, but also whole area of social services, for example. And I know you could say that these very people-oriented topics can be cross-cutting, but I just don't think that really gives it sufficient attention. So I think there needs to be one very people-centered topic there. But I heartily endorse Mark's emphasis on capacity development. I think that means not only that all of the international research projects and coalitions should have capacity development at their centre, but surely we need to have far more principal investigators who are actually based in the South. And last process we really focused on was flexibility. Our assumption was that this is complex research in very volatile countries, highly sensitive, and so the only way to do it very well was to be flexible. And thank goodness we're funded by the SRC, because they are brilliant as long as you keep them extremely well informed about being flexible. I just want to give one nice example of flexibility. Of course, as anthropologists who think that reflexivity has to be an important part of the research, we know that the identity of the researchers makes a big difference to the results you get. But my colleagues wouldn't buy the argument from me and Ruth, and this is the only time we got really stubborn, that we said there has to be at least one woman on the research team. And they didn't believe us. They said, no, it's not going to make a difference. So we did an experiment in Ethiopia, and we had 4 researchers doing an interview with a corpus of women MPs. And 2 of them were men and 2 of them were women. And by prior arrangement, the men left the interview just before the end. Well, it was supposed to be just before the end. But of course, the whole interview changed as soon as the men left the room. The women MPs started explaining how terrified they are when they do public speaking. They reveal all kinds of vulnerability, which they wouldn't have done, particularly in the presence of the most senior person in the room, who had been the Ethiopian man. So, last 2 recommendations for grant makers. One, identity of researchers really needs very careful attention, so I would be looking at that when looking at proposals. Not just we need to have southern researchers better represented in research, particularly if it's in their own countries, but also at the least you need women involved in research teams if you want to have good quality research. And finally, just to sort of build on what is already, I think, a fantastically flexible approach from the ESRC, but not necessarily for all grant makers, because if you allow flexibility, you allow variance to both plan and budget, you are going to achieve far higher impact. Yeah, so that's my point.
Thanks very much.
So I think so when I was thinking about this, I came across several similar points. I'm based here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I currently have 2 grants. One is a health systems development grant. So it's one of the ones under the joint council funding. So it's administered by the MRC, but it's actually funding from the MRC, the PSRC, DFID and the Wellcome Trust. And the other major piece of work done involved at the moment is a World Bank Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund grant for some work in Bali, where we're looking at the impact of malaria and nutrition interventions on cognition and education. So that's The first one is very much health systems, very much a health focus. The other one is more interdisciplinary. And thinking about these two questions about what is particularly challenging about working with partners in the international development grant, firstly, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just finding the right research partners, and I don't think that's anything special about an international development grant. But there are two aspects that make that even more complicated than usual. One is that you're working overseas in a developing country setting, and although that gives you the opportunities to work with local stakeholders, and it helps to perhaps ground the research, there's also the question about the research capacity of the local stakeholders you might be working with. And quite often there's a very small pool of people in the country that have the necessary research expertise and experience. And that means those people are in high demand, and you're often competing with other international groups, and the amount of time they have to work on your particular project, as opposed to all the other projects that they've been approached to, be quite small. And you also have to be very vigilant to the idea that people can perhaps overcommit their time and then actually underdeliver the amount of support and guidance and input that you need. Another particular challenge is the multidisciplinary nature of development research. So it's not only just finding the right people who've got the right amount of time, but finding the right breadth of people with the necessary expertise from all the different perspectives that you might want to engage on with the project. And that has an impact in terms of means a much bigger team of collaborators, more people, and that directly means it's going to cost more. So you have to cost more people onto the grant, you have to cost more travel into the grant if you've got international collaborators, and you end up actually with less money for the research. So I think that's a real challenge when you're wanting to talk about true interdisciplinarity, is about having sufficient funding to really support it, to have the network of people and the input from the range of people that you really need, and to secure their commitment. It also means that there's a sort of increased cost in terms of time for coordinating all these people, keeping sure that they're all on the same page, and some of those issues about trying to communicate across the different disciplines, getting different disciplines to work together when they're coming traditionally from quite different perspectives, and trying to iron out particularly methodological differences, because they tend to be quite rigid. People tend to think about methodology as quite rigid. This is the established way that we should do it, and then when someone from a different discipline comes along and says, well, actually we do it in a different way, it's very hard to establish which is superior, and maybe neither of them is, but this is kind of a negotiation that has to happen within the team. And then I think the other challenge I've come across in terms of partnerships is, again, not particular to international development grants. I think it's common to all grants, but it's that question about thinking about what each partner is going to gain from the research, and whether that gain is going to be sufficient to maintain their commitment and involvement in the project to ensure they have timely and meaningful input that's going to actually strengthen the research. And I think that again becomes harder with interdisciplinary work, because as researchers within each discipline we need to be able to advance within our own discipline, and that means we might need to be able to identify what's innovative for our own discipline at the same time as what's going to sort of bring forward progress in terms of general understanding of the science. So those aren't necessarily particularly key things that funders and researchers need to get right. There are sort of more reflections about the challenges in the process of doing the research. In terms of the things of getting right, I think to make grants a success, you need to have a successful process in order to have a successful outcome. And then also you're hoping to get a successful uptake of the research findings. And in terms of the process, I don't think it's just funders and researchers and what we need to do. But in terms of the process, the flow of funding is quite critical, and it's strongly influenced by intermediaries. So I think we need to also think about the institutional financial systems and administrators that we're working with, and the key things that they need to get right, and the expectations that they feel they're under in terms of, and I think the funders have a particular role to play in that, because quite often the university administrative systems or the research organisation administrative systems feel that they're responsible more to the funder in terms of accounting financially for the money than thinking about, well, if we manage it in this way, are we going to get a successful research outcome? So I think the funders can be quite influential and play a greater role in trying to support that sort of flow of funding. Because I think we all need to be pulling in the same direction, and we all need to be focused on the research outcome if we're going to be successful. In my own work, I work on malaria. It's a vector-borne disease, and seasonality is a very strong element to that, so that the timing of interventions and the timing of evaluations can be quite critical in the success of a project. And this therefore presents a particular challenge, because if the process isn't in place in time, it can really scupper the research. And so there has to be a system which is flexible and nimble. Also, working in developing countries, you have to expect the unexpected, and you can't be too rigid. And that also brings me to one of my other experiences. I mean, with the MRC funding and research councils, this actually works quite well. That once the funding is approved, you get it quite quickly, so you can make quite a rapid start. This is in contrast with my experience in funding from other funders, where it's taken up to 4 years in one instance after to actually get the funding in place. But even with the rapid sort of provision of the funds once it's approved, often we're looking at sort of an 18-month minimum between when you first put together your outline proposal to when everything's funded and in place. And the research, in a way, risks being outdated before you even start. It takes such a long time, and in some cases can take even longer. And yet we need to be able to adapt to changing and the evolving state of knowledge. We want to be able to incorporate new ideas that have come up since we first had that idea that gave us the impetus to put in the grant application. And we need to also be able to pilot and test out new directions in order to think about the next stage, where do we go next. So, for example, the Wellcome Trust with its flexible funding allowance, that's great, because that can be used in that sort of way to be a little bit nimble. It's useful when you can have contingency lines, but I can understand how you don't necessarily always can build them into the grant. But it can also be a problem if the grant management is very rigid against deliverables, and in a way that can potentially be counterproductive to the success of research, which needs to be adaptive. And then my final thought was in terms of uptake and the sort of dissemination of findings. And really reflecting about what is the role of the researcher. I mean, on one hand, our role is to generate evidence, but to what extent should we also be involved in the advocacy for its uptake? And does that also then question the independence of the evidence that we're generating? And I know this is something which is a little bit subject to debate. At minimum, we need to present our findings so that its pertinence is visible. But potentially also it's something the funders can do more to support in terms of the funders themselves directly disseminating the results. So, for example, with the CIF grants, the World Bank has a monthly newsletter which goes out to grant holders, which highlights findings, case studies from the different projects that they've been funding, which that can be a useful form of dissemination. It doesn't, and then that way the research themselves is not directly involved in advocating for the uptake of the results. I think the pathways to impact is a very useful thing in terms of making us think about what is our research intending to do. But again, quite often when you're writing and putting together the proposals, you really want to focus on the science, and so you don't really put much budget behind that part. So to some extent, I think there's a need to sort of put some money where your mouth is. I don't think, as a research community, that it's very easy for us to do that, because we've got to get the research past the reviewers. So the scientific merit needs to be clear, and we need to invest our budget line in terms of that. So potentially it might be more successful if there was a kind of a slightly separate grant process for the pathways to impact the dissemination activities, so that those could actually be output the projects. I think I know grants that I'm putting together not to really give it very much attention, knowingly under budget.
Thanks very much. Yeah. And finally, Kate.
Thank you for all those points. I'm not sure I'm going to say anything new, but maybe I'll say it in a different way. So I'm basically an ecologist that's worked on both modelling ecological systems to understand extinction of biodiversity, but also predicting models into the future and understanding the impacts on biodiversity, so particularly on emerging infectious diseases, and how biodiversity and biodiversity loss promotes zoonotic emergence in different systems. Additionally, I've also worked on developing new ways of monitoring biodiversity. So I've worked with lots of NGOs and citizen science projects across the world. So when Jeff asked me, I was like, why has he asked me to do this? And then I realised that I've worked in over 20 countries in the last 10 years or so. So I think, you know, my perspective is from having NERC funding, but also some of that funding's from DFID and DEFRA, and also EPSRC. So I guess I'm giving you that kind of perspective. So it's kind of NGO focused, but also with academic colleagues in different institutions. And my current grant, I think we have the same funder with ESPA, but mine is about ecosystem services for poverty relation in Africa, talking about the impact of kind of a One Health agenda, looking at zoonotic emergence in livestock and in wildlife, and how that impacts people and human health. So I guess I've got 4 things to say. The most important thing, I think, is co-design, as people have been talking about. I think that the success of your project are going to be dependent hugely on if your institutions or NGOs in country have a stake in what you're proposing to do. I really firmly believe that, and in my experiences across Eurasia and Africa, that is true. You have to bring them in at the beginning, not just like the kind of side thing to say, oh, I'm going to put these people in at the end. It really doesn't work. You need to have something that they want to do with you. It's a collaboration, and you really have to think of all of your partners as equal partners in this, and with a lot of respect. So you have to ask about if the project is going to solve a problem they have, and what the benefits are to them for being involved. Is this just a massive drain on their resources when you could use the time in other ways? Do they have actual ownership of this project, and what kind of legacy are you going to leave when you waltz off back to London? So what are you leaving for them to live with, and what changes are you actually making at the policy level? I think that's really important. So I agree with you about scoping visits. I think they're incredibly important, not because you want to swan off somewhere with NERC funding to visit a nice place, but you have to build those relationships with people. And if you don't understand what they want, then what on earth are you doing there in the first place? So, I would suggest scoping visits or building off existing relationships or building relationships with partners of partners that they know and understand and they know what's going. So in any co-design relationship, you also need something too. So I've been involved in a Darwin project for over 8 years, looking at developing countries' capability for monitoring their biodiversity. And it was a really successful project, but the scientific outputs took a long time to get to come out, and that was because we put a lot of effort in co-design. So you really need to think about what you're getting out of it as well, because it is a collaboration. The second thing is multidisciplinary research that we talked about and how difficult it is. So there's one thing being multidisciplinary and there's another thing being transdisciplinary, and those are incredibly hard things to do. So multidisciplinary is just changing your field a little bit, giving some methods from another discipline. That's, you know, relatively easy thing to do. Transdisciplinary is changing your entire field and bringing in new things and changing your whole conception of what your field is, and that's incredibly difficult. I'm not sure that many projects even get as far as doing that. When you put these bids in, they're usually multidisciplinary teams, and even speaking the same language maybe, but you're using the same terms for different things. So we had, for my ISMA project, we all met and we had this massive row about what rigor in scientific undertaking might be. I think the same kind of row you had. So I was working with lots of social scientists, and they call it forming, storming, norming, and then performing. So we were definitely in the, we formed and then we definitely stormed. Then I think we kind of had a drink, had a calm down, and then we definitely were norming for a long time, and then we were performing, and then the grant finished. So I think there's, it's really important to have long-term projects with long-term relationships with people that you trust, and I think that's really important, trust and respect. So there's a cultural sensitivity too with international projects. How does their country actually work? You can't just swan in and decide what they're going to do because it suits you. You've got to ask them how their country works, and then you need to understand how to affect change in their country, and the only people that know that are those people on the ground. Also, something that I didn't quite realise when I was working in Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, and I walked into this situation totally, and Russia and Ukraine, and we had a kind of conference down in Romania, and I thought this was going to be a brilliant idea, we're going to get together. And then the Romanians, we are taping this, aren't we? Then the Romanians said, I know we've invited the Russians, but will they leave, after the conference? So it was kind of like, there are some, there are some really big cultural differences between countries that, as an outsider, that you've got no idea. There was one Bulgarian team that was after the project had finished, it took me out drinking. They were singing drinking songs about Turkey and how awful they were and how they were at war. I was like, when was this war? 500 years ago. So these tensions run deep, especially in some of these countries. Anyway, so the next one is money and governance, and I think there are, as you were saying, there are massive amounts of transparency and governance issues when you're dealing with overseas countries with fraud. There are requirements for fraud and transparency that we need to follow. So one of my collaborators' projects got investigated by that group, and it was all fine, but it was just about transparency and governance. And some of the institutions that you might want to work with don't have the financial systems that we have. In fact, some of our universities don't have the financial systems that we need to actually do this. You need to transfer large sums of money in an accountable way to another country, and without any kind of money laundering issues or governance and transparency. And you don't know where this money is going to go or whether they're going to use it for what they said they're going to use it for. So there are incredibly difficult problems with transferring that kind of money across institutions. And your reporting cycle may not be their reporting cycle, so you do have to think about that. And then the final thing is about disparity of resources. So I guess when I was working with some of the countries in Eastern Europe, some of the PhD students are poorly resourced and they don't have access to the libraries, and there's all kinds of disparities in what you might expect your collaborator to be able to deliver, and actually what they can deliver is not what you might have the expectation as you go in, because they just don't have the resources that you have. So whether you can think about having exchanges of students or setting up a master's course for training within your project, I think that might be a good thing. And also the flexibility of having money from that welcome call, I think is a really good idea, so that they basically have, in your grant you put in money to say that at the end of year 3 you will have a pot of money that people can bid to do projects for, and so that you don't have to allocate all of the money to start with. And actually that's more realistic than having a plan to the nth degree for 5 years. So it's kind of like your collaborators and partners can actually bid internally for that pot of money, and I think that's a cool, flexible idea. And that's it.
Great, thanks very much. I think our panel deserves a round of applause. So a rich range of ideas and best practices and things not to do. And I guess it was interesting to me that so many of them apply generally to grants, but all of them had a particular dimension that related to development acting grants that added the complexity. Now, with the remaining time we have, we want to open up for discussion, ideas, and very much like other people maybe to chip in their thoughts about the program as you've heard it, and also the challenges that it faces and the opportunities. I don't think we want to have a call for what is the most important challenge to be looking at. We'll pause on that one. That'll come, I think, later in the GCRF process. And of course, any questions from Mark as well. So we have mics that can run around, but if it's slow, you can shout. I think we've got a pretty good acoustic in here. So questions, comments? In the back, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm from University of the Arts, London.
Could you probably need to be a bit louder unless we can get you.
Sorry,
Okay. We have another runner? Okay. We can use mine. No, maybe not. I need
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm from University of the Arts, London, so I'm disappointed that the AHRC person wasn't here. And I was wondering, how do the arts and humanities fit into the GCRF?
It's one of the interesting developments recently is actually that the acting or interim chief executive for the AHRC is actually somebody from a development background himself. So AHRC, right from Andrew down, is starting to think very differently about the opportunities. One of the areas that AHRC have been quite have taken a leading role within the councils in recent years is around the whole conflict agenda, and trying to think about what's the research around that space, what are the issues around that space. So I think there's certainly a continuing theme around there that they're looking to see come forward as part of their plans for the GCRF. The one specific project that I've come across recently, which I think has been an absolute standout activity from AHRC, which is the citizen science work they've sponsored around the Palmyra site, where it's funded through the University of Bradford, where they've actually been trying to capture the memory of the Palmyra facility. And it's a mixture of both the digital records but also the kind of vernacular, if you like, the memories and the things that people are hanging on to. And I just think that's kind of a completely unexpected but nonetheless fantastic sort of opportunity. I personally think there are opportunities across the full spectrum of our research space, and it's the diversity of them that makes it interesting for me.
I might take a few questions and that's the kind of way to get through more. So one here in front.
Hi, Chris Darby from the John Innes Centre. I wanted to pick up Kate's point on disparity, and in particular the way that the Global Campus Research Fund will fund research. Because some of the early talks that we've seen last week on fund research only in the UK, and that runs the risk of exacerbating the disparity. There's a lot of money going into this area of research in the UK, and there isn't any money that can actually be spent on partners as well. It might have a negative effect on that disparity, and what the long-term plan was in terms of where the money was spent.
Okay, if I take a couple questions,
Yeah.
and you don't have to answer the ones you don't want to.
No. I'll answer that one.
Okay, just.
Thank you, Justin Parkers from here in the London School of Hygiene. At the beginning, at times you talked about development research, and at times you talked about research in developing countries. And I wonder if GCRF distinguishes between the two, or knows what the difference is between the two. Coming out of a development studies background, what is the goal of development has been debated, whether it's economic growth, whether it's capability development, whether it's welfare improvement, whether it's sustainability, whether it's local ownership, and so on. And I'm wondering if it has one focus or the other.
One more, perhaps here from the front.
Hi, I'm Claire from the Centre on Global Health Security at Chatham House, and I was just wondering, where does a think tank like Chatham House fit into the GCRF? Would we be qualified as a non-profit, or would we be part of the academia research side of things? I mean, we would do policy work too, research and policy.
Okay.
That's the hardest question. Right. Just the first point about eligibility for funding beyond the UK. And what we have at the moment is the councils effectively having to move quickly within their current policy framework. That makes sense. And looking forward, I hope, so I have to be careful, that we will move to a common arrangement, and I think it will be the most permissive arrangement that we currently have, because I think we have to, as kind of an underlying principle, allow things to happen much more flexibly in terms of allowing funding to go beyond the UK. But to be clear, in the main, that will be funding through UK universities, not opening up our eligibility to overseas institutions beyond that which we always do. And where we do it at the moment, we do it in quite well-defined, well-argued areas. So I don't, but it's a live issue, that's for certain. In terms of research for development, research into development, research as development, I understand the space you're talking about, and it's particularly well concentrated within ESRC's portfolio, where they do see all of those aspects as part of their plans going forward. Across the other councils, it's less obvious as a, if you like, as a distinction. But GCRF will include traditional school development studies, but it also will be research to deliver solutions ultimately. So that's mixed content. And the final question around Chatham House. I don't actually know, because the eligibility does vary slightly across the research council. The core eligibility for all the research councils is UK universities, equivalent research organisations, or research institutes. So that doesn't include think tanks.
But can be classified as a research institute as well.
But the reason I'm hedging my bets a bit is because AHRC in particular do have some they do reach into some unusual places that the research council is going to go. But I don't think actually that we are eligible at present, but I'm not sure.
Okay, any, another round of questions and comments from the panel too. We'd like to get some questions back there.
I can shout, I think. You prefer Mike?
We're recording actually, it's another reason.
Well, Falkenstein University of Surrey. I would like to, first of all, second and what in particular Emma and Kate have said before, not least with the planning stage, if you like, a development stage of projects into bigger phases, the management, the execution, and the problems in the local countries. And from what I heard so far, I'd like you to actually tackle those issues in your answer, because you haven't addressed that yet. And also with regard to where the funding can go, I see huge problems in actually making things properly happen on the ground if we're not, as Kate put it with her example, are able to transfer some of the money into these countries, or properly accounted for, of course, that's without saying. But we need to be able to enable them, and then we need to have management from here. It's a bit of carrot and sticks to some extent, and all of this. But it is highly complex. It will, in each individual area, require a ramping up stage, etc. And a particular question I have for your first calls then, they seem to encourage this in that you're saying, oh, therefore 24 months roundabout in some of the calls, I'm referring to 18 to 36, they should be small. And then they suddenly refer to an upper limit of 600K, which is quite a lot. How about significantly smaller ones in the range of where the Wellcome and the OECD and Gates go with their explorative grants in going for around 100, 150 maybe, rather more, many more, I mean by means of quantity, and really trying to explore where you, I could second what Kate had said before. I mean, there's also hierarchy issues in most of these countries. You cannot just work with one person. You have to do a tour, you have to shake hands, you have to go back. It's extremely laborious, and you can't do these things overnight and without investing into and time and in such scale.
Thank you. Another question, comment? Or anything from?
Actually, so one I know it's a bit subversive because you said don't say topics, but I'm not going to suggest a particular topic. I'm just going to be a devil's advocate. There's always the temptation, I think, for grant makers to look coherent and have very focused themes. And I completely understand that, and politicians love it, and I understand why one gets into that kind of thing. But actually, I think what's involved there is the wrong people making the decisions. Because why should grant makers in conversation with academics in the UK make the decisions about whether energy, although that is actually one of my particular interests, energy is more important than, for example, if I was very young, I would say, well, this is really skewed against children, these particular topics, for example. So why make those kinds of decisions? Why not base the kind of decision-making process entirely on merit and be incredibly tough on the sorts of issues that you're raising about process and whether there's really good evidence that these people have thought through the managerial issues, the ethical issues, the methodological issues, etc., and test people on those criteria rather than making decisions about what topic in advance. Or, if you're going to have topics, to spark people's imagination so they make links between things that they don't normally make, then don't lock yourself into them for a long time, because otherwise you completely distort the sector.
Yeah, please.
So, thank you. So what role does the overseas territories have in the global development fund? Is this a, you know, because they're underfunded, especially for biodiversity, we don't know anything about them. That was a bit of a dig, but what's, you know, is this part, can they be part of this?
I knew that would come from somebody who works in biodiversity. So over to you for some comments on those questions.
Oh, it's fun. I suppose there's a lot of questions here about funding rules, and I was